stand before the canvas in the Louvre, and the first thing that hits you is not the image, but the sheer, suffocating scale of it. It looms over you, 5 meters high and 7 meters wide, a wall of oil and bitumen that seems to physically push you back. You are not merely looking at a painting, you are being invited to step onto a floating tomb. This scene is a chaotic tangle of limbs, a frantic crescendo of human misery rising from the dark, heaving ocean. Théodore Géricault has constructed his masterpiece not as a simple narrative, but as a geometry of despair. The composition is dominated by 2 intersecting pyramids, architectural structures built from human flesh. To the left, the base of the composition is anchored by the dead and the dying, a pyramid of hopelessness. Here, a father figure, often compared to Dante's Count Ugolino, sits in a frozen stupor, clutching the pale, slack body of his son across his lap. His eyes stare into a void that is far deeper than the ocean surrounding them. He has resigned himself to the inevitable. But follow the diagonal line of bodies upwards to the right, and you find the second pyramid. It is a surge of frantic energy, a human wave cresting towards a tiny, almost invisible speck on the horizon. This is the Pyramid of Hope, culminating in the figure of a shirtless man waving a rag of fabric towards the distant brig Argus. The tension between these 2 geometric forms, the gravity of death pulling down and the desperation of life reaching up, creates a visual vibration that makes the painting feel dangerously unstable, as if the raft itself is tilting under your feet. But look closer at the skin. It is not the warm, glowing flesh of the Renaissance. It is the color of the grave. Géricault's palette is a suffocating miasma of necrotic greens, bruised purples, and muddy slate grays. The shadows are heavy, almost swallowing the figures, a technique known as tenebrism pushed to its morbid extreme. This was not an artistic affectation, it was forensic accuracy. To achieve these specific hues of decomposition, Géricault did not rely on models or imagination. He turned his studio into a charnel house. He obtained severed limbs, feet, and heads from the morgue of the Hôpital Beaujon, keeping them in his workspace to observe the precise chromatic shifts of decaying flesh. He watched how death changes the color of a man, from the flush of life to the waxen pallor of the end. He lived with the stench of death so that he could paint it. Yet there is a jarring, deliberate paradox here. While the colors scream of rot and starvation, the bodies themselves are spectacular. These are not the emaciated skeletal frames of men who have survived on leather straps and human flesh for 2 weeks. They are muscular, athletic, idealized. The torso of the man waving the flag is rippling with strength. The back of the dying figure is broad and powerful. Géricault, deeply influenced by Michelangelo, imposes a heroic classical beauty on a subject of grotesque degradation. This friction between the forensic reality of the palette and the romantic idealism of the anatomy creates a profound psychological unease. It elevates the suffering from a mere news report to a mythic tragedy. These are not just starving sailors, they are fallen titans, waging a final doomed war against nature itself. It is a visual lie that tells a deeper emotional truth, granting dignity to men who died with none. To truly understand the weight of the bodies on that raft, we must step off the canvas and into the icy waters of the Atlantic in July 1816. The story of the Méduse is not merely a tale of a shipwreck, it is a damning dossier of aristocratic incompetence and the collapse of civilization. The frigate was bound for Senegal, carrying French officials to reclaim the colony from the British. At the helm was Hugues de Roy de Chaumaret, a chaotic relic of the Ancien Regime, who hadn't sailed a ship in 20 years. He was appointed not for his skill, but for his noble blood, a fatal error that would cost hundreds of lives. Through sheer negligence and a refusal to listen to his subordinates, Chaumaret drove the flagship straight onto the Arguin bank off the coast of Mauritania. When the ship began to break apart, the class divide became a death sentence. The lifeboats were reserved for the wealthy, the officers, and the governor. For the soldiers and the crew, the expendable masses, there was only the raft. It was a hastily constructed platform of lashed-together spars and boards, roughly 20 meters long, intended to be towed by the lifeboats. But the raft was heavy, unwieldy, and burdened with 147 terrified souls. In a moment of supreme cowardice that would stain the French Navy for decades, the captain and the officers in the lifeboats cut the tow ropes. They cast the raft adrift, abandoning 147 people to the mercy of the open ocean, with no navigation tools and virtually no provisions. The descent into hell was immediate. The timeline of the raft reads like a study in human de-evolution. By the first night, the few casks of wine and water were already being fought over. By day 4, the veneer of naval discipline had completely disintegrated. Hallucinations set in, fueled by thirst and the blinding sun. Paranoia turned the raft into a slaughterhouse. Mutinies broke out, resulting in a brutal cull where officers and soldiers butchered each other with sabers and bayonets in the pitch black of the night. The raft became slippery with blood, the boards washing over with the red foam of their own violence. But the true horror, the shadow that hangs heaviest over Géricault's painting, arrived around day 7. With the food gone and the wine exhausted, the survivors crossed the ultimate moral threshold. They turned to the custom of the sea. The living began to eat the dead. To survive, they carved strips of flesh from the corpses of their comrades, drying them on the mast like beef jerky. It was a complete regression to a primal state, a Hobbesian nightmare where life was indeed nasty, brutish, and short. Henri Sévigny, the ship's surgeon and one of the few to survive, described these events with a clinical, chilling detachment in the account that Géricault would later obsess over. He spoke of how the stronger survivors eventually decided to throw the weakest and the wounded overboard to conserve resources, a calculated, cold-blooded murder of the most vulnerable. By the time the Argus finally appeared on the horizon, only 15 men remained of the original 147. They were shattered, half-mad, and stained with the guilt of what they had done to stay alive. This is the reality Géricault absorbed, not a heroic struggle, but a shameful, bloody collapse of humanity. When Géricault unveiled the Raft of the Medusa at the Paris Salon of 1819, it was less an art exhibition and more of a detonation. He did not give it a safe mythological title. He initially called it Scene of a Shipwreck, a thin veil that fooled absolutely no one. The public and the critics knew exactly what they were looking at, and for the restored Bourbon monarchy, it was a direct, humiliating indictment. The wreck of the Méduse was not just a tragedy, it was a political scandal caused by the government's nepotism in appointing an incompetent royalist captain. By painting this specific subject on a monumental scale reserved for kings and gods, Géricault was forcing the French elite to stare at the rotting consequences of their own corruption. Critically, Géricault chose his moment with the precision of a dramatist. He did not paint the mutiny with its chaotic violence. He did not paint the cannibalism, which might have turned the viewers away in pure disgust, dismissing the survivors as monsters. Instead, he chose the moment of false hope. The painting depicts the instant the survivors spot the Argus on the horizon, a tiny dot that represents salvation. But here is the crushing irony. In the actual historical event, the Argus did not see them the first time. It sailed away. The raft was left to drift for several more hours in agony before the ship returned. Géricault captures the survivors suspended in that excruciating limbo, frantically signaling to a savior that is turning its back on them. This choice transforms the painting from a record of a crime into a study of abandonment. The reception was polarized, violent, and confused. The classical critics were appalled. They looked for a hero, a central figure of virtue to anchor the moral narrative, but the Raft offered none. There is no Napoleon crossing the Alps here, no Horatii swearing oaths. There is only a collective, tangled mass of suffering. The hero is the group itself, or perhaps the hero is absent entirely. The painting challenged the very purpose of art in the 19th century. Was it to elevate and beautify, or to confront and expose? Géricault answered with a resounding roar of dark realism. He stripped away the divine protection usually afforded to subjects of high art and showed humanity alone, cold, and rotting under an indifferent sky. Today, the political scandal of 1816 has faded into footnotes, but the painting's power has only metastasized. It has shed its specific historical skin to become a universal symbol. We see the Raft in every image of refugees crossing the Mediterranean on overcrowded rubber dinghies. We see it in the collapse of social safety nets. We see it in every moment where the vulnerable are cut loose by the powerful. The Raft is no longer just wet wood and rusty nails. It is society itself, breaking apart at the seams. Géricault left us with a haunting question that still echoes in the halls of the Louvre. When the ship of state goes down and the structures of civilization are cut away, who do we become? We look at the man waving the rag, desperate for rescue, and we realize that on the open ocean of history, we are all, in some way, adrift.